Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection Podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfin. So believe it or not, a biologist from Yellowstone who we haven't had on the podcast just yet, but as a recommendation from two of our podcast alums in Jeremy Sundaraj and Taylor Raby. He's been a biologist for the Yellowstone National Park Wolf, Cougar, and Elk Project for over 2 decades. And really, we want to get into prey dynamics and this shift that we've seen that was touched upon in a couple of our previous podcast episodes. And who better to talk to than Matt Metz. So Matt, it's, again, wonderful to meet you. Great to tap into your brain and your knowledge and all the stuff that you're doing. And just welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to start with, for being in a position that you were, and I know you just mentioned that you had, you just got a little bit of a bump or a promotion or whatever it was from research associate up to an NPS employee. Where does that journey for Matt start? Were you native Montanan? Did you come from another place? Where did your journey start before you got into biology and doing the things you've been doing for the past 2 decades?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not a native Montanan. I'm a Buckeye. Ah. So I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I didn't really grow up going out into the woods much or things like that. I kind of lived a life dominated by playing soccer and kind of following sports in Ohio. So I'm still something I'm passionate about still today. I love Buckeye football. I'm trying to pass that on to my 5-year-old son. And so my journey kind of into this world happened more kind of when I went to college and kind of started getting into backpacking, traveling. I started college in Ohio at Bowling Green State University. But through backpacking or other sorts of travel, kind of started to see this world that I didn't totally know existed. I mean, I watched some TV shows and things like that as a kid and did little hikes here and there, but kind of really the world opened up for me. And, it kind of started me on a direction where I changed my major a bunch at the university. I was an awful student to begin with, like really awful. Just didn't apply myself. It wasn't that I didn't have the brains to kind of pull through those classes. It was, I didn't go to those classes. But that changed as I kind of got direction. I started drifting more and more towards environmental science, things like that were offered at Bowling Green. And then ultimately kind of discovered there was careers in wildlife biology. And so, a handful of years after I had been at the university, could have graduated pretty soon. I transferred to Missouri and moved to Montana. I went to the University of Montana to finish up my undergrad. And my experience there was much different than the start of my college career. I applied myself very much so and was there for, about 1.5 years or so, taking all the core coursework and kind of led to a career now in wildlife biology.
Just talk about that just for a little bit more, because I'm similar to you. I was still am a big sports guy, but it seems as though there are these moments in time, and you just mentioned it, when you start backpacking or learning about the outdoors and that there is a career path for these types of things. Can you touch upon, I guess, what that opened up in either your brain or the rest of your body, where you were like, hey, this is actually a pretty cool and unique thing that I want to dive into? Because it seems as though there's a lot of track for this with a lot of our guests, is that grow up on the East Coast, they grow up in a place where there's not a lot of, they're not surrounded necessarily by an abundance of nature, and they end up falling into these careers, these journeys, these paths for decades on end. So can you pinpoint a time or a moment, I guess, that really was like, hey, I'm going to go do this?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there was a precise moment per se, but it was just like, the more you kind of get out and you do these things, you're like, wow, this would be cool. I could actually, somebody's going to pay me for this. And now, of course, my job at this point doesn't quite align with the thoughts that you have when you're 20 years old and what you think you're going to do in that career. But I still get out and do a lot of that as well. So it's more just kind of this constant, or this exposure to that keeps increasing. You're like, wow, this path exists. And so for me, as I kind of got into it, I'm also a bit nerdy with it. And I was like, oh, cool. So people are tracking these populations and they're trying to understand what drive them. I come from, my father was an accountant, my grandfather was an accountant. So I have some kind of mathy parts to my brain. And so I was like, ooh, that could be kind of fun. And, you know, and then you get to go out in the field and record the data to kind of eventually think about what drives these populations. And so, yeah, I don't know there was any specific moment. It's just like, I don't know. It's kind of like some sort of drug, of course, where you're like, oh, this is fun. So like, I want to do that more and go into the woods more. And so, you know, do that as much as you can and balance of other things in life. But, you know, and so it's really just that kind of, I want that feeling more of being out in the woods. And, you know, early in one's career, that's what you get to do. You get to be out in the field all the time. And so you just feed it more and more. So.
Yeah, it certainly unlocks something a little bit different, right? That we always think maybe the track is always 9 to 5 or in an office or something like that. When you get the opportunity to unlock those things, it just opens an entirely new world up to you. Talk about and this really seems, I don't want to call it a specialty, so correct me if I'm wrong, but really a lot of your work is talking about predator-prey dynamics in Yellowstone, which is very interesting. And we'll get to a little bit of the shifting prey base in just a moment, but tell everybody why it's so vitally important that people are aware of the predator-prey dynamics in Yellowstone. Obviously, we're talking about wolves for the most part, but how are you studying or calculating, as you were saying, counting these populations, fluctuating season by season or whatever that may be, and why that's so important as for research and information, not only for yourselves, but for the general public?
Yeah, I mean, I think questions that we often get are like, what is wolves' relationship with prey? Or what is cougars' relationship with prey? And kind of how do they affect each other's populations? And these are kind of core things that ecologists have been interested in for, you know, better part of a century, of course, right? And so we just kind of build on a lot of those opportunities. And so, you know, the work that I've, you know, done most in my career is really the foundational part of our program when wolves were restored. So when wolves were restored to Yellowstone, there was kind of two goals, I think, in some ways. The first was just to restore wolves, and that meant a lot of management. And so that predated me. I started here in 2002. But, you know, the number one goal was to manage wolves. And so that was intense for the first few years, just bringing wolves back. And then if they left the park, there were things that were sometimes done that like we don't do today. We don't go and bring wolves back ever. And that happened occasionally. And so that was a huge time suck, but and an important like part of the program, the key part of the program at that time. And then the other thing that happened was that a lot of work, and it was led by Mike Phillips was the project lead at that time, and then Doug Smith, who was the biologist at that time, and of course became the project leader for many years, wanted to start a research program to understand wolves' relationship with prey. And at that time, and in many ways still, the foundation was kind of just understanding some key concepts like how frequently wolves ate in relation to differences in kind of prey abundance. That was kind of the classic kind of predator-prey theory, is all based around this kind of pretty simple relationship that's also really, really hard to get at often, especially for some of these relationships that take decades to kind of materialize, how you can kind of see how things change. And so that was really based on Doug's experience in Isle Royale. And so a winter study program was implemented, and I'm sure others on the podcast have probably talked about it, but we really have these intense periods from mid-November to mid-December, and then the month of March, where we're out every day, flying as much as we can. We have some packs that we're doing ground-based observations on as well. And then for the last 15 years, also GPS cluster searches. And so those are all done independent of one another so that we can use math to kind of estimate what we miss, because we're certainly not naive enough to think that we detect everything that wolves are feeding on. And so by doing that, we can kind of then estimate these relationships between how frequently wolves kill or scavenge, as we'll probably get into later, and the abundance of various prey. And it's really these kind of foundational things that we can then build on what effect wolves may or may not be having, or cougars may or may not be having on ungulate populations through kind of having some of these key statistics.
Wow. What makes studying the relationship between wolves and their prey so difficult? A thing that comes to mind is that snowshoe hare lynx story that kind of circulates in wildlife conversations a lot, where there's that, I think at a time they called it it's like a 6-year cycle, but now it's more like it's over 8 or something like that. It's a much larger window, but this cycle of where you can sort of predict to a degree the fluctuations in lynx populations and based on the hare populations, and they kind of do this very predictable thing. Is there no equivalent to that with large predators, and why is it harder?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's harder. That would be presumptuous of me to say, right? But like, again, it's similar in that these are very long-term relationships. Yeah. So our best knowledge comes from Isle Royale with wolves and moose. It's a pretty simple system in that way, in that it's right. Really mostly wolves and moose, a little bit of beaver. But even there, you're still talking about decades. There's periods in each of these, or like 50 years plus of work, right? And so, and kind of, I did my master's actually with John Vucetich, who has been the co-PI at Isle Royale for a long time. And all of these periods, like each 5-year or 10-year period, they differ maybe from the last. And if you only did these little snippets, you wouldn't really have this understanding. You need variation in each of these populations, and right in the wolf and the moose population there. Here we need it in the wolf and the elk and maybe the bison and the cougar, whatever it is. And these take long time to kind of come about. In the elk population, the variation that we've seen in it has been over a 30-year period now. Wow. And the other part about it is wolves are they're hard to, and cougars especially, but it's hard to detect their kills and detect them consistently. And then each of these things that I mentioned, like we use an airplane, and you get up maybe 15 or 20 of the 30 days. And then you get a little snapshot of the day. So if they have an elk calf, you may or may not have caught it at the right time. The ground has the advantage that we're out there all day. It's an advantage for us. It's kind of rough on folks like Jeremy and Taylor who are out there now, and they're out there from sun up to sundown. But if they blow through an elk calf or a deer or something like that, and you see it, you have the opportunity to see it. It's not a snapshot per se, but we don't have the night. Okay, well, now we have GPS cluster searches that give us that, but maybe aren't great at always detecting deer or something like that, that if the handling time isn't long enough. And so we actually take advantage of all of those different things to kind of get a better estimate, or at least we're trying hard to get a better estimate of kind of the total number out there and what they are. And so each of those things is one data point, and they take a lot of effort to get. And so to kind of get that relationship between how frequently wolves are eating various things over different abundances of prey just takes a long time to materialize, because you need lots of data points to do that. And at the same time, Yellowstone offers one of the best places in the world to do that, because wolves are highly observable here by a ground team. That's unique, right? And the plane, we can do some for some intense periods, and the GPS clusters are, that's employed more widely. But the work that we do can also maybe show, okay, well, have these other sources of finding carcasses as well. So if there are some kind of, fundamental like little flaws in a GPS collar in an animal, like to use it to find their kills, we can identify that, and that can be useful in other places as well then. I mean, overall, they're pretty good. So that's good news for everyone, right?
Yeah.
When you're doing this kind of research, is there, with so many things that affect, things like weather patterns or habitat reduction affecting ungulate numbers, is there a way to efficiently, or at least sufficiently, separate those two things when you're trying to decide how predators affect prey?
Yeah, I mean, there is. And so, and it's hard. Yep. The first, so John Vucetich let us study, like almost 20 years ago now, looking at the initial decline in the elk population when wolves kind of at the same time as when wolves were introduced. Now, the other thing to point out is wolves being reintroduced wasn't the only thing that was changing at that time. The cougar population was also increasing at that time as well, just through natural recovery, as well as the bear population, the grizzly bear population as well. And then Yellowstone's also, like northern Yellowstone in particular, is home to I think the densest black bear population that's been recorded. Wow. So you have a whole bunch of predators on the landscape as well, many of that were recovering at the same time as wolves. But anyway, going back to John's work, really kind of what he did was he fit time series data from, I think it was the mid 60s until after the first decade after wolves were reintroduced, so through 2004 or 5, and kind of said, okay, the elk population fluctuated in these ways due to variation in weather, like you were talking about, both snow and measures of drought, and then also hunter harvest.
Right.
And so basically over that first decade, you could kind of explain, he explained the decline in the elk population without invoking predation really at all. And so within there you had severe winter of 1996, 1997. It was a really severe winter. And then drought conditions in the early 2000s. And, and at that time there was a late hunt in the Gardner area. And that late hunt was human harvest and was focused on antlerless elk. And so those are females and calves. And those females, that a human hunter, we tend to take things more in line with the population. And so the average age of females at that time killed by hunters was 6. You compare that to something like wolves, the average age is about 13 or 14. It really hasn't changed over this time. And so those individuals have less impact on kind of future population growth because they're not pregnant as often anymore. They're not unlikely to have more calves, and and then those calves have to survive, but the potential for them to contribute more to future growth is less because they're at the end of their reproductive life. So those are the sorts of tools that were used then and we'll probably use again. And we haven't done that yet. But the overwhelming kind of thought at this time is that the role of predators, including wolves, is greater now than it was then, and through the first decade. And it's really pretty simple if you ignore all like kind of the age structure and the importance of female elk and things like that are important. But just a general understanding is that wolves and other predators kill a higher percentage of the elk population now than they did then, because that's a product of two things. It's all these, how frequently they kill prey, in this case elk, and how many wolves or cougars are on the landscape. And so because there's fewer elk really in many ways, and the number of elk that wolves kill has declined as well. But because there's still 40 to 60 wolves most years on the northern range, that percentage is actually higher now. And there's some nuance there when it's higher and when it's not. But we believe that wolves and other predators play a more important role now to the elk population than they did before. And that ignores some of what we'll probably touch on in that it's also a multiple prey system. And so that matters too.
That's so interesting. Jeremy, I believe, told us a similar thing of the average prey of wolf packs is cows beyond their breeding prime, essentially.
I mean, it's all pretty simple, right? Exactly. One of the things that I like to talk about with wolves is I often say they have two goals when they give talks to the general public. They want to breed if they can, and they don't want to get kicked in the head. And so all of these sorts of things. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so,
I mean, who does?
that is something that is just, okay, that cow is more susceptible to predation.
Yeah.
They're not cougars. They're not ambush predators. So they're known and they're looking for something in those prey. And I don't know what they see. They do. Otherwise it wouldn't come out that they're always getting those old individuals.
Yeah, we've been talking about that a lot, just the things that they see that we probably don't.
Yeah, and every once in a while we can see something. I mean, part of my dissertation work was kind of went against some of these sorts of things in that, many years ago as a technician, I just started to pick up on, well, geez, I can't believe they killed this antlerless male elk. I haven't even seen one yet.
Wow.
And it turns out that there's something there with when elk are losing their antlers in the spring. These are, of course, sexually selected weapons with their primary use being to breed.
Right.
But elk shed them beginning in March here. And those individuals that shed are actually in the best nutritional condition among males. And yet wolves they're taking those individuals because there's something about that deterrent that also matters as well.
Right.
Now, other individuals are quickly coming on that are also losing their antlers. And so it's worth the risk for an elk because your odds of being the one that killed are probably still really small.
Right.
And the benefits of starting to grow your antlers outweigh that cost. You want to breed. But, it's all these little things that affect what may make an animal vulnerable. And so that one's a little different than the classic, like, oh, they're old, they're young, they're weak. There's also other things that make prey vulnerable, and that was one that we were actually able to see versus like when we're watching them sift and sort through a herd, we don't know the age structure of the elk that they're interacting with,
Yeah,
so
definitely.
interesting. Just a side note, during that antlerless hunt period, how did FWP determine the average age of cows taken? Is it you have to report the kill and then they take a tooth sample or something, or how did they?
Yeah, it was through a tooth sample.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure if there were requirements at that time to give a tooth, or it's just, a lot of times these things are like they may be required, or maybe like, if you're willing, please give us a tooth sample. And then we count those just like we don't. Matson's lab does it for us, where you count it just like you count the rings of a tree, because elk are seasonal kind of in the nature in which they're growing. Like what they get to eat it kind of declines, of course, in its quality in the winter. You get very distinct rings, and so we can count how old these individuals are. So that's something we do with every carcass that we get to. We go to a lot of carcasses, both wolf kills and things that they may be scavenging on, and we pull a tooth when it's there, when we need to. Like, we don't pull it from a calf because you can tell from a calf and a yearling how old they are from their teeth eruption patterns, and so that would just be a waste of money. And so we don't pull it in those cases.
One more random question before you go, John. Sorry.
No, it's fine.
I've heard that speaking of antlers and this kind of strange antlerless bull situation, I've heard that there may be, I don't know what to call it, but such a sort of natural evolutionary drive to grow antlers because breeding is kind of it's the point, I guess, for animals. Like, breeding is the success, that ungulates may develop even either the equivalent to or literally osteoporosis, kind of, I guess, siphoning nutrients from their bones to basically build antlers. Is that a thing that you've heard or
Yeah, I've heard the same. So this was kind of a side project for me that turned into a dissertation chapter. So I don't know all the details, but one of the people that I worked with on that project, so I did my PhD at the University of Montana with Mark Hebblewhite, and one of the cool things is, like, when you form a committee, you get to find other fun people to work with. Yep. And so
That's cool.
That project, I worked with a professor at the University of Montana, Doug Emlin, as well. And so he's an evolutionary biologist that studies animal weapons, and has written a great kind of popular book about animal weapons. It's a super fun read. But primarily has historically studied weapons in beetles. Because that'd be a much better way to go about it than elk that are living across broad landscapes and things like that. And so, there's not a ton of knowledge actually from elk with some of these sorts of things. Most of our knowledge that I leverage comes from red deer,
really,
which is, for a long time had the same genus species as elk. Now they're different, but so it's a bit apples to apples. But there's populations of red deer that have been very well studied for a long time, where we understand things that drive antler growth. But I have heard that they're dipping in at those key times of years into their own bones to kind of facilitate
the breed
growth of their antlers. Yeah.
Wow. That's so interesting.
Yeah. Throw all their eggs in that basket,
Yeah. So. The animal weapons research is one of my favorite things to dive into. It's so cool.
Man, that is fascinating. That's some awesome stuff. So with all of this that you've collected or your colleagues have collected, I know this is kind of a broad question, is have there been, have we seen that, like, or have you been able to determine basically that there's always this argument that wolves have this huge impact on these huge prey, these huge ungulate herds, or they're shifting everything around. It's obviously not just wolves. There's obviously weather, which you talked about before. So have those sorts of statements sort of dissipated a little bit now that you guys have this decades long batch of research, understanding the different sorts of prey dynamics and things like that, to where you can basically show that, hey, it's not just this one set of species, because, and I'm taking this from other podcasts that we've done and stuff, that, for a set of wolves, 10 to 20 wolves to call or like, basically make this herd as small as it was in those like 2 or 3 year periods, nearly impossible. I mean, for that stuff to happen. So have you seen sort of those statements dissipate in a way because the knowledge is now out there about the harsh winters and so on and so forth, that it's not just this species, there's a whole thing that's happening here in the ecosystem?
Yeah. I mean, I think overall, there's an understanding that it's really complex and there's lots of things that affect it. And I think, one of the other key things, I mean, a lot of the interest is with the elk population. It's been, paramount among people's interest for over a century here in Yellowstone. And so that's why there's pretty decent understanding of what the population has looked like through time. And so one of the things that maybe has kind of decreased some of that narrative more than anything is that the elk population stopped declining, really, right? I mean, the elk population, the northern range population increased, much of that in recent years, and much of that is driven by outside of the park as well. So like, that's the best habitat for elk. Like, it's the lowest elevations just outside of the park. And so the numbers of elk outside the park, I may get this a little wrong, but it like hasn't really changed all that much through time. What's changed is the percentage of the overall elk population that lives outside of the park in the winter, the winters outside of the park. So most of those elk then come back into the park in the summer. So it's a very like dynamic system. And so that portion of the elk, or the overall elk population, has increased a bit in recent years. The total number the number outside the park is probably about the same, maybe increased a little bit as well, I think. And then inside the park, there was a period that these numbers were declining. And so, exactly how that's occurring, like there's probably some like density dependent habitat selection where it's like, okay, we're going to move outside the park now a bit because there's fewer elk outside. And so it's kind of filled in. So it's not like, maybe it's always been the same elk. Well, of course, it's not been all of these same elk over 30 years outside the park, but it's really this like, I hesitate to use the word, but stabilization of elk inside the park as well and overall. So, kind of the narrative that like it's going to go down and down and down and down because of wolves or other predators or whatever, like that ceased to happen about 15 years ago. It started to kind of flatten. And really, that's probably changed as much as anything. It's just that, oh, okay, they're not going to like be down to less than 1,000 or whatever the concern was if there was a precise number. I mean, we as biologists included in America are very obsessed with like precise numbers of animals, that isn't necessarily shared by ecologists and biologists in other parts of the world. But we are. And so I think just that it didn't just keep going down and down is maybe the biggest thing that just happens. Like, oh, okay, all these animals can kind of live here together, and there's not going to be like no elk left. In fact, we have more now than there were, 10 years ago or whatever it was. And, I mean, a lot of that is probably due to, there's also been other components of the system that have changed, of course, over that time period. And so, the biggest change is, so I mentioned before, I showed up in 2002. And in 2002, when I went out into the field in the winter and I looked out, I spent a lot of my time on the black-tailed deer plateau with the Leopold pack. And so when I looked out at that time, I get up to one of our observation points, look out and there's just a ton of elk. And today, if you look out in those places, you see some elk and you see a ton of bison. Okay? And so like bison are really one of the other things that has really changed. And so much of the increase in the northern bison population, those individuals that are breeding in the northern range or we think are related to this population, much of that's increased over the last 15 years. And so, what we look at today is different. And so that also has an influence on the system. Like it's not, I think when I first showed up, people would characterize it as like ignoring other carnivores and things. There's always been the fascination with the wolf part of it, right? And myself included. So wolves and elk. And so today I would just, that's just a wrong way to think about the system. It's wolves, elk, and bison, and that's a narrow way to think about it too, because we have these other predators that are important as well. But within kind of the wolf lens, it's really a wolf, elk, bison system. And wolves eat other prey sometimes. I mean, they eat in the northern range, they eat deer, some as well. It kind of varies among packs. And with kind of packs the size that we have, and wolves that are larger than the wolves that are in Minnesota, like I kind of think of deer as like an oversized Cliff Bar. Like it'd be hard to like just totally sustain your pack on just living on deer. And so they're eating elk and then some deer in those parts, or they're eating bison as well, or whatever it may be. So
do you see that, and that's an interesting point you bring up about bison moving to these different parts. So obviously this is part of what you guys are seeing, is that the ungulates themselves are starting to stretch a little bit more. They're not relegated to these specific parts of the park where maybe, like you said, when you started 20 some odd years ago, it was like bison are here, elk are there, deer are here. It seems as though they're starting to rotate or move around in different ways that could be affecting other ungulates, as opposed to obviously the lions and the bears and the wolves all together moving these ecosystems around.
Yeah, I mean, to the degree that like competition among ungulates is like affecting one another, I don't know. But there's also like, I mean, so like when wolves were introduced, it was also that the bison were distributed differently in the park. So the central herd, or the animals that were breeding in Hayden Valley, was the larger segment of the population than those that were clearly breeding in the northern range. And maybe sometimes there's some confusion of like, is that northern range or central, just kind of some areas on kind of the outside or in between. But you can largely tell kind of these are northern range bison, or winter on the northern range, and these are in the central. And that started to flip around 2008 to 2010, somewhere in that time period. And the northern range population slowly got the larger of the two. And today is the larger. It's about 70% or so of the bison population in the northern range. And so we don't know why. People don't know why that happened. And so it may happen again. I mean, maybe we don't know, right? I mean, that's one of the beauties of long-term monitoring and research, is kind of the ability to kind of try to explain the past. I mentioned before I did my master's with John Vucetich, and he often said we're really pretty good at explaining the past, and we're really awful at predicting the future. And I think that's a fair thing. Like, we don't know always what the future is going to look like, because you can't predict that some disease may come in or something else may happen, like a stochastic event. And so it's a bit foolish to kind of think that exactly where it's going. But we can try to understand some general properties. And so in this case, like bison being, outnumbering elk now in the winter in northern Yellowstone within the park, that obviously has the potential to affect the system. And we think it has, specifically for wolves, because wolves eat bison and cougars do not. And bears are sleeping largely.
So why, I mean, we'll go, I want to get right into it then. What have you seen from your perspective, from your research? Because I think it was Jeremy that brought this up, that there has been this, it hasn't been this cataclysmic shift where it's all these packs, but he was stating, and I'm sure you could speak to this more, is that wolves are starting to shift their diets slightly, or more so, to hunting bison and killing bison more so than elk. what have you seen? What are the reasonings for that? Is it pure because they're more available in the northern range now, or what are some other factors that you've been tracking, or at least starting to pinpoint as to why this shift is happening?
Yeah. So I'd hesitate to use more so, but
Okay.
but you know, so wolves they're the ultimate opportunist.
Yeah.
I mean, they eat
Absolutely.
whatever they can. And so we talked about that with respect to kind of the vulnerable prey, and they're looking for that. So the other thing that like wolves are like seemingly never going to pass up is a free meal. And so so the first way that we really kind of saw it come about on the northern range, for the most part, there's a little bit of an exception, but was through scavenging. And so, you know, there's just bison there, and bison aren't like elk in the sense that most of our scavenging on elk comes about through winter severity. And for bison, winter severity doesn't seem to have any influence on the rates that wolves scavenge bison. It's all tied to bison abundance. And I think of that because bison tend to die in strange ways. So they just are dead, or they fall through, the ice. Like the Blacktail Ponds is, of course, a famous place where people get these amazing opportunities to view wolves and grizzly bears feeding on bison carcasses pretty close to the road, because a bear comes and pulls it out, and then you have a meal available that these animals are eating over the next few days. And that happens other places as well. And so it's really just the number of bison kind of drives this. And so as the bison abundance has kind of gone up over the last 15 years, more and more of these opportunities have come about to eat things. And the other thing is, so some of those are like these random events, like falling through the ice, and other of them, like bull bison, are more prominent among scavenged carcasses, even in the winter. And so that means that like it's kind of a supersized scavenging opportunity, as opposed to like killing a bison calf. Right. So it's much larger, of course. And so scavenging, therefore, has the opportunity to be more influential in that not only are these appearances like coming about a little bit more in the landscape, they're also really big when they happen. I kind of think of them as like a beached whale. I mean, it's not quite that dramatic, but it's a ton of food that's just out there available to eat. And so that is kind of as the bison population has grown a bit larger on the northern range, more and more packs may have that opportunity, at least for a decent portion of their year. And so that's all kind of winter based. And then in the summer, like certain packs, like the Junction Butte pack, maybe the Molly's pack, they are also feeding on bison that are dying like during the rut or from complications in birthing. And so we see these pulses in these times of year as well. And so I'm not sure that the Junction Butte pack ate anything but bison for this month for kind of a month and a half or so. And so that's kind of the scavenging bit. And wolves also do seem to be starting to kill bison a bit more. And so there's some prerequisites to it from some work led by Amy Talion and Dan McNulty's lab. And it's kind of like, you usually have to have a big enough wolf pack. You usually have to interact with bison groups that are kind of medium sized, of like 10 to 20 or so, I think it was. And then there's usually the presence of calves in that system, and so, or in that group. And so, wolves are often taking bison calves, but they will take females and even male bison. And, there's the idea of learning in predators, and it's really hard to kind of prove. And so we're at this cool point where maybe we will be able to kind of see some of this, this behavior of killing bison actually kind of stay within the system, because I mentioned there was one kind of exception before the scavenging thing in 2010, or at least quickly hinted to it. And that's when the Slough Creek pack formed in like 2005 or so. They killed some bison for a little bit when they were here, because they formed with males from the Molly's pack. And then the females, I think, were from the Druid Peak pack. But like those males brought with them the experience of knowing that like, oh, that's actually a prey item too that we can eat. And so we had this little blip in the mid 2000s of bison kills as well. And it was really just due to that one pack that knew that they could do it. So that's a bit long-winded to say, yeah, availability of those prey matters a lot.
Totally. Let me jump in real quick.
Yeah, you do
I know you wanted to ask something. Do you, to that end, Matt, what you were talking about with the knowledge, it's not out of the realm of possibility then to maybe conclude, or at least start to hypothesize, as you were saying, that the knowledge base of some of these wolves that are in these larger packs, Molly's Junction Butte, if they, tear off, if they're like, oh, some of these wolves sort of parse off into other packs, as you said, they're bringing this knowledge to maybe these smaller packs and saying, hey, I have the keys to a larger prey item that we can maybe try and take down. Is that somewhere in the hypotheses down the line, or is it too early to really determine if that's a thing?
No, I think it's fair to hypothesize about that for sure. It's definitely too early to tell that that's a thing, but it's fair to hypothesize about it. But I will point out the one thing about this that is tough. It's all still a matter of circumstance. Like,
right,
if you present a wolf pack with the option of killing an adult bison or killing an elk, they're probably, like, almost certainly going to choose the elk. And so we kind of, know this, like, so like the Molly's pack in particular has the longstanding reputation as like, they're the bison killers, right?
Yeah.
Well, they're not in the summer when elk come back. They eat mostly elk.
Right.
And so, it's still a matter of like, well, what's available to you is still a fundamental component of that. Now, that being said, if you have that knowledge, you're familiar with it, you feel like you know how to do it, yeah, maybe there's an increased chance that you see a bison that you think is vulnerable and you take it. And we see a little bit of that, certainly with like the Junction Butte pack and the Rescue Creek pack. When we search GPS clusters for them in the spring, like we definitely get bison neonates in their diet. Like, and so that's not something that maybe happened as much 20 years ago when there was maybe more elk or more vulnerable elk or whatever it is. So, at that time in May, there's elk in Slough Creek and Lamar Valley and, the Tower area. But yet these packs in places where they go and they hunt where there are bison neonates, they are taking them some, right? And so they do like see them as a source of prey now. And but they're generally not trying to kill a bull bison in May either, right?
Yeah. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I had a question, but it's just too cumbersome, dude. It's too much. It's too annoying. So it's not like a trend that you're seeing. It's just a matter of bison living or grazing in places they didn't usually graze. It's just an opportunity.
Yeah, in many ways. And so we leverage this information actually. So I talked about at the beginning, so winter study was designed to kind of estimate how frequently wolves fed on these prey. And at that time, was how frequently they killed elk really is what we were thinking, or what Doug was thinking about. And so, we're leveraging that information about like how frequently wolves kill elk, how frequently they scavenge bison, how frequently they kill bison, to estimate different functional responses of like how frequently wolves kill these prey in comparison to things. And this all kind of stems from my PhD research, but it's some work I'm doing with, some folks at the University of Montana, including my PhD advisor, Mark Heboit, and then a colleague down at Utah State University, TJ Clark Wolf, and some others down there as well, and kind of building predator-prey models where we parameterize our models from like the real data that we've collected to see how we expect like the elk and wolf populations to behave,
right?
Depending on like introducing new ways that wolves can acquire food. And it's not meant to like totally mimic the dynamics of Northern Yellowstone, because as we've talked about, there's all these different things that are going on, right?
Yeah.
But what we see, and when we submit the paper, it'll be out in the world one day, but it's really that like this feeding on bison, in particular, scavenging on bison,
right,
is like it can be a stabilizing force on wolf elk dynamics. Because if you like think about the simple system of wolves and moose and Isle Royale, if you look at those numbers through time, they're kind of all over the place, right? And so it's, and some of that's because there's these stochastic things like disease that like say, no, you can't follow this kind of cycle that you would independent of any of this other stuff. But that predation, it's kind of like the lynx hair cycle, of course, right? And so it kind of gets just pushed around and there's a little bit of a lag and whatever. And the complexity of the system and having like a big prey like a bison that's both killed and scavenged can stabilize, we think, these dynamics between like wolf and their primary prey of elk.
You mean take pressure off of elk populations, sort of? And
yeah, I mean, basically, when you're eating a bison, in theory, you're not killing an elk.
Okay, so now you're touching too much on the annoying hypothetical question I was going to ask that now I have to ask it.
Just ask it.
And no pressure to answer hypotheticals. It's just more just burning curiosity. But okay, so that's interesting that it stabilizes the elk population, or I guess takes some pressure off it, because so this is what I'm curious about. Is there a reality where, or do the models show in any way that, okay, so because they're focusing more on bison, and bison are a much larger prey, which I assume equates to more nutrients or more calories, therefore more successful offspring and all these things. And does that, in the models, does that create larger packs? And then I'm thinking individuals from those packs split eventually, as they tend to do inevitably, and that sort of bison sponsored increase in numbers means more pressure on elk outside of the park or where there aren't bison, because there is a larger number of wolves than there would be if it were just an elk and wolf system. But with this secondary and also much larger prey base, they trend in that direction where it's more wolves spreading from the packs that hunt bison into more than usual wolf packs spreading out and hunting smaller ungulates disproportionately than they would have.
Yeah, no clue.
Yeah.
But
I told you it was an annoying one, but I
mean, there's all good thoughts in there. So there's no sociality in these and like the models that we've developed so far. That's areas that we're interested in the future. I mean, we're kind of starting with kind of the base, but the other key parts of the models that you kind of touched on is like, grow the wolf population. We don't let the wolf population do that. Mm-hmm. So the thing that we know about wolves is that, or many of us know, is like that wolves regulate their populations. They kill each other.
Exactly.
And so we have a density dependent death rate in there that says like, you can't just keep growing, like, and so that that's a key part of the model actually to like work, but it's also like a key part of reality for wolf populations that, we don't just grow and grow and grow. This wolves, they affect each other's survival.
Right.
The more wolves there are, survival goes down for an individual wolf. Like we know that from Sarah Cubane's work here in northern Yellowstone.
Yeah. Wow. So to that also, describe this top-down forcing that you wrote in one, because then this is more about the carnivore predator side now, because you have these three big predators on the landscape, or four, I guess, if you include black bear, but I don't think they really care about or take down elk or anything like that, deer to that end. What does that mean, and how does that affect both the relationship between these carnivores, or what does top-down forcing mean? How does it affect the carnivores, and then how does it then translate into the prey and ungulate system if we're talking about deer, bison, and elk? I mean, deer probably less so, but more elk and bison.
Yeah, I don't totally know how to answer the question, so I'm not going to totally try.
Okay.
But I mean, what I'll say is what I think top-down forcing means to me, it's expressed by predation rate, which it's the percent of the population removed by a particular predator. Across all predators would be total predation rate. There's some nuance there, right? Because like wolves and cougars, they kill adult elk. Grizzly bears largely don't, but grizzly bears kill elk calves. And they're the dominant predator of elk calves, and black bears kill elk calves as well. And so they probably matter in that as well. They're the dominant predators on like especially summer survival of elk calves. In the winter, it's a little bit unknown. We're hoping to start a new elk calf mortality study in a couple of years. And, some of that would involve like, can we also think about overwinter survival? So top-down pressure to me is kind of like, like, what is the percent of our population that gets removed from this top-down force is one way to think about it, right? And then I think you're kind of hinting at in some ways that the complexity of the system also affects that, because none of these things are happening in a vacuum. And so like we know from work led by Amy Talion that like bears affect how frequently wolves kill. And they did so in a bit of a counterintuitive way for us. We thought that like the presence of bears at a carcass would cause wolves to go make a kill more again sooner. And instead it was the opposite. And that is really because we think that, you know, it's dangerous to go out and kill an elk or bison in the summer. And we're better off kind of hanging out here and getting some bites off of this thing that we already killed than going out and trying to make another kill and taking on the inherent risk that's involved there. But our expectations were driven by of like it causing wolves to make another kill more frequently. We're driven by work in other systems on cougars and bears, where that is what happens when a bear usurped a kill, it caused wolf or cougar kill rate to increase, so they made their next kill sooner. And indeed, that's what we see here. Some work by Jack Raby, who's a PhD student at the University of Minnesota with Joe Bump's lab. You know, it shows us that when when cougars are displaced by wolves or bears, it causes cats to increase their kill rate.
Right.
And so, you know, it's all in like how that feeds in. We don't know yet. That's right. There's other students that I can name that are looking at some of those components, right? But it's like, you know, I mean, these things are really complex, and we're kind of leveraging a bunch of different new sources of data or new methods, so GPS data. And so, you know, kind of all that, like for a while, we didn't know as much about cougars in this kind of period from when Tony Ruth stopped her work and when Dan Staler reinitiated the cougar study in 2014. We really have this great like kind of 10-year period now of where we've had all these different carnivores, both top carnivores marked, and kind of offers us how they respond to each other. And so it's all part of ongoing stuff. So stay tuned to, you know, that's Wes Binder's work. So
that's good though. And real quick, I know Stephen, you wanted to jump in. Just and this really feeds into, Matt, I would think, right, that these perceptions of how successful wolves are, because as you said, if there's a free meal, we're going to stick around the free meal instead of expending energy and stuff like that. So they are extremely opportunistic. They will scavenge. They will, I think, eat berries on occasion, things like that. So I'm sure there is some parallels drawn to this stuff of saying, hey, wolves are going to do what they need to do to survive, and most of the time take the easier route out as opposed to collaborating on a plan to go kill an elk or a bison. I can't be too wrong on that, right?
Totally. And I'm not sure if they collaborate or not, but
whatever. You know what I mean?
No, I'm just joking. You know, they take those other sources of food because they're not really good at what they do. Like, you know, I mean, so Dan McNulty's work, you know, these numbers are always kind of tough, but it's like in the winter, it was like less than 10% of the time or something, wolves are successful when attacking a group of elk. And so like, that's not a super high success rate, right? And so I don't know what it is for cougars. I don't know if people know or not. My guess is it's higher, but I don't know. And so that like kind of limitations in their ability to successfully bring down a prey probably leads for them to go like, oh yeah, I want to eat those other things, and things like berries, which, you know, I've heard as well. It's like, well, it's the time of year that's actually really hard for wolves. Like, so wolves kill the most in the summer, but they get the least amount of food because so much of their diet is coming from neonate newborn ungulates that it doesn't translate to like bang for your buck. But it's really hard to go kill a adult elk in the middle of summer when they're feeling pretty good. And so, you know, that's why you get in those systems, I would imagine, like them eating whatever they can.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of calves, have you observed wolves hunting calves ever or just infrequently? I mean, do they have any meaningful effect on calving rate, either directly or in some kind of roundabout way?
In like calving, like the
Specifically,
calving rate, meaning how many calves are produced?
well, maybe that's the wrong term, but just calf survival probably is a better word.
Yeah, so they have not been a driver of survival. So the best analysis is a huge meta-analysis from the Northwestern United States. And this was specific to like neonate survival, so the first 90 days. And in that case, it was like spring precip mattered a ton, and then it was bear predation. So the way that you would look at that is how survival changes as cause-specific mortality also changes. And so you would expect survival to decline as cause-specific mortality went up if that predator mattered a lot. And it was only bears at that time period that has like this additive effect on survival. Now, that being said, the work here in Yellowstone was done pre-wolf. Then Shannon Barber Meyer's work in the early 2000s. And then we haven't done it since. And so that's a part of upcoming plans is to look at elk calf survival again and see if there's changes now with, different elk numbers, different bison numbers, whatever it may be. Wolf numbers are less now as well, but to look at that. But as far as we know from that perspective, no, and we don't know, totally unanswered in our system at least, is overwinter survival of elk calves. And so wolves or cougars could affect that. Like we don't actually know the answer to that.
So basically, stay tuned is what we're, which is good.
It's always the answer, right?
Of course, but that's what keeps us coming back for more. I only have a couple more things for you, Matt. So Stephen, if you have something, please feel free to jump in. So for the future, then, Matt, just give everybody, I guess, if you can, a sort of snapshot of what the next. The next batches of research that you're talking about, were those some of the things you were leaning at just now about figuring out these different prey dynamics, looking at bears and cougars a little bit more as they're integrated into these systems? What are you looking at, a couple years down the line here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a big direction overall of our program is it's a big focus that Dan really has us thinking about the multi-carnivore nature here. And so there's a lot of work that continue to go in that direction. And then, we are at kind of seems like this cool pivot point of like, are wolves going to kill bison more frequently in northern Yellowstone? Are they not? And so a lot of that just builds on a lot of the long-term work that Doug initiated 30 years ago. And so we'll continue to leverage. It's really unique to have this sort of long-term data from systems. Yeah. And it's also disproportionately important in ecology. So it contributes a ton to our understanding because we get these long periods and it's not, our conclusions may have been very different in different sections, as I kind of talked about before. And so we'll certainly continue that work. We have, I'm really interested in working with Dan and Kira and then colleagues at Utah State, TJ Clark Wolf in particular, of kind of thinking about things related to wolf sociality. So kind of the drivers of kind of association between individuals within packs, between packs, bringing that into kind of population models for wolves that acknowledge that they're social. And so building integrated population models for wolves. And then, the other thing for us that's just a huge kind of focus is this kind of new area of bioacoustic monitoring. And so we have, we've been targeting that over the last year and kind of collecting data to see what it looks like, what we can record. A guy that we work with, Jeff Reed, kind of looks at, what these different howls look like and maybe maybe one day we can tell individuals apart, all these things. But this winter, we're kind of putting out a bigger effort in that it's going to span a wider area of the northern range and start to think about it as a tool to think about communication within and between packs if we can, to think about how one could use it to estimate wolf abundance in systems where you can't easily count wolves. And so that's a huge area of future work for us as well.
Yeah, this is all fascinating stuff. I mean, we spoke with Jeff Reed and Taylor talked about this bioacoustic, which is going to be, it really seems like it's going to be a game changer in so many different ways for all of you. And we're really this only just leads Stephen and I to ask for more podcasts to learn about all the new stuff that you guys are finding out. So this is just, all this stuff is really incredible and fascinating, and you guys do a fantastic job as always. My last question for you, Matt, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Resiliency.
Nice.
Yeah.
We will have the link to Matt's, many of his papers that he forwarded over to us. So just if you have any more information, go to the Yellowstone website, look these people up. They do incredible work. And as always, it's great to speak with different folks and talk about all these different things. So Matt Metz, thank you for your time and all the work that you're doing. Really fantastic. Thank you, man.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Absolutely. Stay tuned when we signed off. How's to y'all out there? We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.